So start off with, I'm just going to look at the panel, and this panel will be familiar to some of you guys that saw the Aerostar modifications from an engineer's point of view video a while back. What the hell's all this stuff?
Yeah.
I don't know what this stuff is. This is round stuff. I'm used to square things that are black until you turn the power on. And it does a lot of stuff for me. I actually have to fly this airplane.
This is a Lockheed C-141 panel.
I'm Eric Reese. I sell real estate for a living, but I fly and instruct in the Aerostar for fun. Join us on our travel and training adventures in the world's fastest light piston twin. And today we just went through a bunch of little things. I had a bunch of questions because Jack is entrusting his beloved airplane to me to fly to Aerostar tomorrow, which is in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And you are selling the airplane.
True.
And you've been flying for, how long have you been flying?
More than 60 years.
More than 60 years. That's...
I'm not getting any better.
And you flew for the Air Force.
Right.
How long were you in the Air Force?
20 years.
20 years. And flew...
Big transports, C-124s,
Okay.
Convair T-29s, Cessna Skymasters, and then T-29s again. So about 5,000 hours.
Okay, but you also, didn't you fly the T-Bird also?
Pilot training.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's what, that's pretty cool. So
I loved it.
some jets time.
Yeah, it seemed like a vacuum cleaner.
Yeah,
You
there
didn't
you
have
go.
to worry about all this stuff.
And so did you go through the academy?
Yep,
Okay, and I think you had told me that you're an MIT graduate,
correct.
and your master's is from MIT?
Yeah,
Okay, so that's in electrical engineering?
no, Aerostar.
Aeroastro,
Yeah.
okay. And then you went on and got another degree after that.
PhD at UCLA in mathematics and economics.
And that's so you could go out and make some money after Air Force.
It just seemed more interesting.
So that's pretty cool. So, so 25 years in the Air Force, and how much time did you have after you got out of the Air Force?
I think about 5,000 or 6,000 hours.
Okay. I think my dad, after being in 4 years, had about 1,100. So
Yeah. Well, my first 2 years in the air, 3 years flying C-124s, I got 3,000 hours. I got way more than 1,000 hours a year.
that's a lot of time.
And that's half of it I was asleep on autopilot.
Don't tell me that.
I
So
was-
then you told me a story a while back about finding out about the Aerostar.
Yeah. I had the Air Force, excuse me, the Air Force said, we're going to keep paying you flying pay for about the last 3 or 4 years, but you don't have to fly because you're only checked out in pistons. We got jets. And I thought, good, I don't have to go 4 hours a month to do that. But I missed flying, and so I got all of the civilian, I had a commercial license, but I got an ATP and a single engine instructor and instrument instructor, and enjoyed it very much. And of course, I already had 600 hours of T-37 or O2 time. So, I like piston engines. And so when I never saw an Aerostar until I was in graduate school, and it was actually floating in my swimming pool in Canoga Park. And one of the first Aerostars, this was been 69, was flying around. It had a distinctive sound, and I looked at it and said, that doesn't look like any piston airplane I ever saw. And the more I found out about them, I said, I think my future has to include being able to fly one of those things. And it's not going to happen in the Air Force. So I switched my major to something that I could make some money at and was still interesting. And when I got out of the Air Force, I started a financial model building company and sold output to people all over the world, banks, insurance companies, and very quickly borrowed money and bought a high-time Aerostar, and hired a mechanic, and after about 20 years, we got it to be perfect.
So even back then.
Yeah.
So when did you buy the Aerostar?
83.
83. Okay.
Yeah.
So that was the year that mine was made, and then the last ones were made in 84.
Yeah. Well, mine was a 75,
Okay.
and it was a 601P, pressurized. And then over the years, it got upgraded to the higher horsepower engine, low compressions, intercoolers, better turbos.
Now, is that this airplane?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you've had this airplane that whole time, and this is the only Aerostar you've had, and you keep making little improvements like we talked about in the last video. So, how much total time do you have now, and how much Aerostar time do you have?
I got about 2,000 Aerostar time, and I don't know how much I got. 8,000.
Okay.
So I quit counting a long time ago.
Yeah. Now, do you keep a paper logbook or a digital logbook?
Paper, but I quit logging flying time.
Right.
Years ago. And I should also confess that as I got over 80, I went from being a insurance company low risk, high experience fellow to a high risk old guy, and they kept raising the rate, so I have had no insurance for the last 5 years.
No insurance, including liability, or just hull insurance?
Just hull, but I did get the Vemco's got a hull insurance. It's inexpensive and it's
Okay.
good. Yeah.
I've heard that about a Vemco recently, that they've actually had some pretty good rates, so that's kind of
Oh,
nice.
it's tiny rates, $600 a year
Just for the liability?
just for the liability.
Wow. Well, that's pretty good. Fun. Somewhere along the line, you decided that you were going to go out and set some speed
Speed
records.
Yeah.
And what prompted you to do that?
Well, first I looked at the records,
Okay.
and an Aerostar had the record for 2,000 kilometers, where you go 1,000 out, 1,000 back, same altitude, and it was 200 and I think 37 knots, I believe, and it was held by a guy named Jack Chrysler.
Okay. That name's familiar.
Yeah, and the airplane I had would do slightly more than that. So I thought, why doesn't anybody go out and set the speed records? And the more research you do about it, the more difficult it is, because ideally you would like to go up to 25,000 feet and have 2 hours worth of 100-knot tailwind, and then turn around and come back and have another 200. But those are hard to find.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, I said, there's a lot of things on this airplane that could make it go faster. Obvious things. Aileron gaps, seal the gaps, just make it look like a glider more than anything else. So I started doing them, and I was lucky enough to have a full-time IA that was working for our company, and most of the time, and doing computer work the other. And he wasn't shy about putting stuff on. But over the years, some visible and invisible mods occurred, and all of a sudden it's going 15 knots faster than book. Well, 15 knots faster than book is good enough to break the 2,000 kilometer. Nice and hard.
Now, this is, when we talk about the 1K and the 2K speed records, obviously it's close courses, out and back.
Right.
So you go to a fixed point, turn around and come back.
Exactly.
Now, are you measuring ground speed, or are you measuring true airspeed for that,
Right.
or do you calculate it all?
It's got to be at least 2,000 kilometers by your examiner,
Right.
your guy that comes out. That's all done, GPS, one point, another point. And your time starts when you cross a 1 kilometer box.
Okay.
The test is you define an electronic point, and there's a little 1 kilometer box around it. And you define a turnaround point, at least 1,000 kilometers out there. And there's no box, but it's a point. And you have to turn around so that you go past that point.
The 90-degree point from
Right.
that you're crossing. So you have to physically be past that point before you start your turn.
Exactly. Or you've got to have the defined turn point between you and your start point sometime. Well, believe it or not, that takes a little practice. It really takes practice, because there you are on autopilot, and as you watch, I used to think I could do it by looking out the window. You can't, not at 25,000 feet. And I was always turning around at places like Harvard, Nebraska, which is a dirt field. Nobody ever lands on it, but it's on the map, coordinated. All right, so what happens is the observer comes out, weighs your airplane or watch its weight, looks at your fuel, doesn't check whether it's even airworthy. They don't care.
This is FAI people, right?
Yeah, they go and see, count the number of engines and all that stuff.
Is it FAI or FIA? FAI. Federal it's French. Something aeronautique.
Yeah, what you said.
Yeah, what I said.
All right.
Something like that.
All right, so if you simplistically think, well, I'll just get him out here and I'll fly up to that departure point and level off and magically get in that box, which is requires, you can't go up and do that exactly. And then fly all the way out and I'll leisurely turn around that point. All that time is counted against you, but the distance is, you got to be there. So if you're sloppy in your start, it's illegal. If you're foolish enough to cross the starting point a little slower than cruise speed, you're doing stupid because it takes 5 or 10 minutes for power setting to stabilize. So you have to back that off. You have to learn how to do that. And then you have to find a route that at 25,000 center isn't going to be in a military operating area. Because if it's in a military operating area and you're just going on your low speed record, they say, whoop, you got to go this way or that, then it's over. So it took me a long time to figure out where. And it turns out from Colorado Springs up towards Minnesota, southern Minnesota is in there. Then I discovered this other thing. They can have pop-up military operating areas. So you could be anywhere and they could tell you, whoop, you gotta turn left 30 degrees or go up or down 1,000 feet. And I didn't know you could do that. They could do that. So then you had to learn how to sweet talk the center into doing what you wanted to do instead of what they wanted to do. I won't go into too many details, but the final record flight for 1,000 kilometers, everything was going nicely. And of course, when you do this, you've got a GPS and you're flying on a good GPS. You know your start time exactly, and you know what you hope. You have an idea of your tailwinds or headwinds, and you have kind of a how goes it? Am I ahead of record or not? If you're well behind, you might as well stop.
Yeah.
And I did that because I had a simultaneous GPS failure of both of them, right in the little box start. All right, so you're going along, and at the center happened to me. I was not in a military operating area, and center was working a tanker. And there was a co-pilot in a tanker doing the radios, was very pleasant, very accommodating fellow. And Senator said, well, I want to do this or do that. I will ignore that. That's not there. That's Eric calling me. And I was listening to them. It was VFR and things were going pretty well. And I know what I had was 37 inches and 2,300. At 25,000 feet. Okay. And I was truing 280, 281. And I needed 280, 281 to break the record by 1%. So I just think, I got this made, everything is wonderful. Then the controller calls me and says, 21 Delta, we need you to turn left 30 degrees or descend 1,000 feet.
Oh, no.
Flat out. And I was shocked. And the only thing I think of to say was unable. He came and said, what do you mean unable? My brain, and I'm sucking oxygen, to keep my brain functioning because it's 11,000 feet. And I kept thinking, what can I say to not do that? And later on, I thought I just should have radio failure. That would have solved the problem.
Then you would have had to answer a whole bunch of questions, though, later.
No, but I'd have the record. I didn't care.
Yeah.
But anyway, the only thing I could think of to say was, I am on a sanctioned world record speed record attempt. Full authority you don't have. Yeah. And if I change my heading or altitude, then I kept thinking what I'd say, it would be bad. So I could say, because if I were to say, then I might as well not go. He would have said, Roger, you're cleared to Colorado Springs.
Yeah,
He'd have been happy to. So,
well, what's wrong with that? And those guys had to have been okay with that.
I didn't want to do that. So then the wonderful co-pilot of the tanker pops up and says, Can I be of assistance? We don't have to be at this altitude. And the center controller said, well, yeah, I guess that Aerostar didn't want to turn. Can you turn left 30 degrees? We'd be happy to.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's
And
fantastic.
then after that, I kept thinking, what should I have done? What I should have done is say again. Just keep saying, say again. Finally turn off that, try and turn on the other. Senator, you've been trying to call me. Play that kind of game until it was.
I like your story better because you got the other tanker guys involved and everybody was happy. And
All I could think of was that, this is not fun.
Yeah.
If I have to buy $1,000 worth of fuel and coordinate with that.
do it all over again. Because I know from the stuff that I did in gliders, getting the hard part is not so much breaking the speed record. And I held a Nevada State 300 kilometer out and return for a standard class glider for about 10 years.
Wow.
Wasn't super fast, but it was all the other stuff that you had to go through to get the sanction, to set it all up, to get through the gates properly. All that stuff had to be just right. But so that's cool. And the records are printed on the side of the airplane.
Yeah.
Which is pretty darn cool.
Painted on.
Painted on.
Now the the guys, the examiners, they said, why don't you paint it on the gear? Well, I'm not like a Thunderbolt or a huge land flat. My little gear.
Yeah, this little tiny thing.
Little tiny thing. So they said, well, put it on the side. So I put it on
perfect.
the side. So the first one I put on, and when I broke the second one, it was just plenty enough room to do that. Now, here's the interesting part. So you spend, I used to say I spent 20 years in the Air Force getting overeducated, 30 years running a company, getting overpaid, and then sold a company and lost all the mission. And what am I going to do with the airplane?
Mm-hmm.
No reason to go 1,000 miles. And I spent 5 years breaking speed records. Why did it take that long? It just took that long.
Yeah. Well, all the thought process and the little things and the minor improvements that can still be made to these airplanes. I mean, some of the things that I noticed, they're subtle, and they're, each one of these things makes a little bit of difference. And you add them all up, and it starts to be pretty good-sized numbers.
Well,
but
you're exactly right. The problem is that you don't know which things are helpful and which aren't.
Yeah.
It takes a flight test to do it, and the flight manuals are not helpful. So I had to dust off my MIT degree and come up with a so-called Jacobian matrix of differentials of what's the effect of airspeed on a change in temperature or a change in weight, because those are never constant. So that was helpful a little bit, but
because then you could plan.
Well, then you try something and you're not quite matched the weight and temperature, and you could see whether it really made any difference or not.
So I mean, some of the things that I noticed that were subtle were just how little things like this airplane has boots, and most people wouldn't think of using a booted airplane to do speed records because you do have some disruption of the airfoil and the flow. But
gliders don't have boots.
No, they don't.
With edges on them.
No, they don't.
No.
And just that little tiny bit of smoothness on the trailing edge of the boot to take that little lip, which is probably tripping a little tiny bit of or you would think maybe it's tripping a little bit of the boundary layer, and that would be drag.
Yeah.
But whether it worked or not, it's kind of nice to feel those, and they're nice and smooth.
They do. I'd hate to think how many hours it took to do that.
Oh, I'll bet. I'll bet. So what was and then we'll kind of move on a little bit, but what would you say are the one or two things that you did to this airplane that made the biggest speed difference? And don't tell me you just pushed the throttle forward. That didn't count.
I got a roommate that used to fly FB-111s. Have lunch with him. He said, well, you got the record yet? And he said, no. Well, you just put all the balls to the wall. That's how you do it, Jack. I said, it doesn't work. Oh, sure, it'll work. The balls being the throttle balls.
Yes.
All right. Well, to some extent, I don't know.
Okay.
Because if you look at what happens to air when it comes into the engine and goes through the intakes and goes into the turbos and all that sheet metal. And you look at that, it's got sharp angles on it, the angles of the tubing that comes up to the air box behind. It's got sharp corners and stuff like that. And you look at the fluid dynamics things on how you make that airflow better. Those are called minor drag losses, and they add up a lot.
Yeah.
And the problem is that you don't know quite what they are. And there's not a whole lot you can do with Aerostar that I did to take the airbox and where the sharp welded things come up. I took a file and made a radius on them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I make too big a radius, they fall off.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know how much that added, but I did that a fair amount. And before I got the airplane, somebody had put in a crude deflector because the airbox went back and it was a right angle. Well, mine came with a little curve. So I improved the curve. And then I tried to figure out theoretically, what are you really getting from this? And that is not an easy question, because you've got to have this thing called Q, the dynamic pressure, and what do you do with the adjustments and so forth. And finally I got to the point I was going to make it just as smooth as I possibly can. One of the things you could do is, that I did, was the exhausts are made and they're turned down so they don't get exhaust on the flaps.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the first Aerostars had them cut off. And Ted Smith knew well, and the Germans knew well, you don't turn it costs you.
Mm-hmm.
So I cut mine off a little bit. Christie did some things. So a combination of that improved flow inside and obvious drag stuff, outside.
Well, gap seals and just
Yeah.
the flaps, the interface between the flaps and the wing
Yeah.
when they're up and all that
Yeah.
stuff is pretty rough.
Yeah, mine had silicone, closed cell silicone that wouldn't burn. I had that glued in there, so when the flaps come up, there wasn't any air possible.
Yeah.
And these things take forever. And as it got to the point where I knew I could break the 2,000 kilometer speed record, I looked at the 1,000 kilometer speed record. It was set by a Super Belanca back in the 60s or 70s, and it was fast. And I could not, in this airplane, the regular 700 could have broken the 2,000 kilometer speed record any day, particularly if they put a bladder in it.
Mm-hmm.
But it would have taken a lot of time and love, and they would just barely have broken it if you had non-standard, if the winds changed on you, or turbulence, or you messed up anything in the turn. They had a hard time. Well, I had an easy time with it, and then I broke the record again, finally. And then I looked at the 1,000 kilometer one, and the first one you're fuel limited.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have enough gas. And that 1,000 kilometer, you're power limited, because you got plenty of gas and you're not going as far. But when you're power limited, then I had to spend a lot of time with Steve Spear on the turbo maps. So what's the RPM and manifold pressure combinations that I could legally do without blowing the turbo? There were people who advised me, said, so blow the turbos. Said it so that all 4 turbos explode just as you cross the finish line and you glide it in. What do you care? Well, I kind of care. I didn't want to do that.
Well, yeah, $20,000 worth of turbos. I mean,
So yeah, I'm not a glider pilot, and I can't go from 25,000 to didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
So I came up with a setting that Steve Spear said that was within 95% of it. All right, then it turned out that when the first 2 runs I did, you have to break the speed record by 1%. And I've kind of forgotten what it was, but I couldn't break it by 1%. I could just barely break it by a little. And so then I started working on turns, and I started working on ways to make it so that I was all lined up and at cruise speed as I crossed the box, and that required lots of conversations with departure control. So they had what they finally called, I guess, a 2-1 delta departure, where I go straight south and make big sweeping turn and barely go in the Fort Carson area up to 25,000, lined up 10 miles from the box on autopilot, tweaking all this. Well, they didn't much like anything about that, but they tolerated it. And then if I made a regular flight and a departure, they say, you want one of your normal departures? No, I don't have to do that anymore. As it was, at first I had 3 efforts. First 2 efforts on the 5 efforts on the 1,000 kilometers. The challenge of it was that you could go up in this airplane with all the drag stuff I could think of on it, and the the winglets add 3 knots. Chrissy doesn't say that. Bacon knows that, but I know that.
Mm-hmm.
So they add 3 knots to cruise, whatever they do to pitch. And that was, I couldn't have broken the record without them. Well, what happened is that the five efforts, the first was I came close, but I was off by half a knot.
Mm.
And it wasn't perfect conditions and the wind shifted, but you can't, I found myself studying jet pattern winds in the Pacific and trying to guess what they're going to be like as they drifted across. All right, the second one was both GPS recorders failed at the same time, right south of Space Command, and I was suspicious they zapped them somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But they stopped, and I saw that they'd stopped, and I thought, well, there's no sense continuing the flight because I've got to have
Yep.
a recorded time. So I came back, and we sent them both off and had them overhauled. Then I had autopilot problems, and I got those fixed. And then for the third one, everything was going well until I got about halfway to Nebraska, and a plug fell out of the turbocharger, dumped all my oil out over the wheatlands in Nebraska. I'm at 25,000 feet. I realized for sure the record effort is over,
Mm-hmm.
and I, of course, pulled the throttle back, and when I pulled the throttle back, I lost my pressurization.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I wasn't breathing or thinking too well. And then I looked over and discovered my oxygen was 0 because I had mistakenly taken the mask off on and off when on the exhale, and so it all leaked out. So I was simultaneously presented with no oxygen, no engine, no pressurization at 25,000 feet. So somehow I declared an emergency and
Dove on down.
got down real fast, and I said, find me a 10,000 foot runway that I can get to it when I call you back. And Center was wonderful. They got down, they said, we don't have one. How about an 8,000? That'll do. Where is it? So anyway, I could see the airplane was flying fine, one engine was shut down. I was fearful of a fire because I didn't know that. So I could look in my mirrors and I was ready for the fire bottles, and what am I going to do if I have a fire? And I'm like, I had a plan, which is I'm going to put that thing on the ground real fast, and then there was a couple thousand feet. Didn't have a fire. And then wonderful town in Nebraska, 8,000 feet of runway. I declared an emergency. Nobody else was there. And I had screwed the thing up, so was going to the VOR instead of that. I wasn't thinking real well. As I was heading to the VOR, I said, well, there's a big runway right over there. I said, oh, yeah. Off I went. And I landed, and at the end of where you touched down, there was a big fire truck. And at the end were the 2 big fire trucks. And when I rolled up there, 4 of the biggest, huskiest Nebraska firefighters I ever saw, dressed in silver suits with foam, get ready to spray on me. They opened that door and whipped me out of that airplane. I thought, woo! And in fact, it turned out that all it was a plug that fell out. It was in the cowling. They put it back in. Didn't damage the engine or the turbos. I flew it local for a while, and I flew it home, and finally figured out how to plug all of the turbos. It turned out that does happen, but it didn't happen quite so spectacularly. All right, here comes the 5th flight.
Mm-hmm. This is the 5th and final?
5th, well, I hoped it was the
Okay.
final. I thought the 2nd was the final. And this time, was when I got the radio call, my final one. They said, hey, you need to change it. I said, I don't want to do it.
Oh, no.
And I didn't have to, and I broke the record by what I had to do by a knot and a half, which was good enough.
That was what, 278?
277.
277.
But, the average true air, that was time to time, counting the turn. I was at the end where it was lightest. I was, I calculated with compressibility, and I was going 282. With 37 inches of manifold pressure, 2,300.
Which is probably about
300.
75, between 75 and 80%, somewhere in there.
More than that.
Okay.
I think it was closer to 90.
Okay.
I don't know.
Because I know, our normal climb in the 700 is 37 and a half inches,
Yeah.
2,400 RPM. It's about 80, that's just a little over 80%. It's 81%, something like that, I think.
But you probably are limited at 25,000 for how much of that you can hold,
Yep.
at least. And so there I am.
I can get it to that, but everything's got to be really tight.
Yeah, yeah. You know, if for a while I was entertaining the thought of, since it's the starting point and the end point, but they don't care where you go for a route, I'm trying to find some kind of a dip in the jet stream where I could start off and go one way with 100 knots of tailwind and 10% farther and come back with only 50 knots of headwind.
Right.
And you could find them where that would add. But the problem is you couldn't forecast them. You didn't know where they were going to be.
No.
And then the other thing I had was flying the right way around a hurricane with 100 knots of tailwind all the way. But I just...
That sounds more complicated.
I checked my contract and it said I don't have to do that.
So that's pretty cool. So you had a lot of fun doing that. That took quite a while.
I enjoyed it a lot, and what I liked about it was that I said I can do anything I want to this airplane and then take it back off to make it legal to sell it if I had to. I wasn't sure when I had to.
And then when was the 2000 record was set just a couple of years ago?
Yeah, 2019.
Okay.
Fame.
And you were over 80 at that point?
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
Well over 80.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So,
you know, the only counseling I got from that was the examiners. One of the guys had pointed out that since turns cost a certain amount of time, if I went more than 1,000 miles out, which would be fine, say 10% farther, then there's 10% more fast speed to cancel. That was helpful because I pushed it out a little bit at that point. But he told me one time, after about failing the second one, I told my wife, he says, you know, I think Jack's about ready to quit of this stuff. And she said she didn't know.
I don't see you as a quitter.
Well, if I couldn't, you know, how many times do you have to try it?
Yeah, well, that's true.
But finally he gave me a compliment. He says, you've got a remarkable amount of endurance to do this day after day after day. But I only had to do it that one time.
Well, that's pretty cool. So if you like the video, please subscribe and hit the like button and all that kind of good stuff. And of course the bell, because that way you'll get notifications on when the next video comes.